Sometimes it's one person. Sometimes it's a loose combination of people who just do one act of trafficking. Sometimes it's even friends, people who pose as romantic partners. So we have to open our eyes, because the reality is trafficking can be anywhere and can be in any form.
Rahel Gershuni, thank you for being here for Justice Talks. I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is an increase in the global attention on human trafficking. What explains that increase in interest and attention?
Well, I think that it's the scourge of this century, because we're suddenly aware that slavery has not passed from the world. Modern slavery, which is trafficking, still exists. As to the question, is there more trafficking than there was? Is there more slavery than there was? I really don't know. There may be more reports of it. Maybe for years people didn't know this was a crime. And certainly since the adoption of almost universal ratification of the United Nations Protocol, I think more attention has been paid to this crime.
There's also clearly a need to investigate and prosecute some of these crimes, yes, and those most responsible. So what are the biggest challenges that you face and that the world, the international community faces in investigating and prosecuting human trafficking?
I think two of the most important challenges are the stereotypes people tend to hold about victims. If somebody doesn't appear to be a victim in someone's stereotype, they will not pursue a case of trafficking. For example, if a victim is assertive, a victim is articulate, a victim is a citizen of the country with support systems, they may not be, these cases may not be prosecuted. And it's too bad, because as a US practitioner said, victims come in many shapes and sizes. That's one challenge. The second challenge, I think, is to identify and prosecute cases of labor exploitation. I mean exploitation, slavery, forced labor, and servitude. And the reason that that's particularly hard is because the police are not used to this arena, the arena of the normative employer. They're used to criminal arenas like prostitution, like criminal organizations. But when it comes to a factory or an agricultural settlement or even domestic in the house, police are hard put. We just had a training session in Uganda, and I presented some participants with a case study on domestic servitude. And indeed, there was a disagreement if this was a mere labor violation or if it could constitute trafficking for forced labor.
You just mentioned something that I think is very interesting and important, that victims come in different shapes and sizes. How do we identify the victims of human trafficking? How do we know if someone's a victim?
Well, I think that there are basically two ways. First of all, there are things that you need to open your eyes and ears to. If you see a person who has injuries, you see a person who appears afraid, you see a person who's afraid to speak when he's being accompanied by his employer, you see a person who is in a sort of catatonic state, open your eyes and ears. Then if you hear the person telling a story with any of the following, some violence, lack of payment, restrictions of freedom are a big red alert. And here I have to interpose that, of course, identification is different than pursuing a case. Identification, these are red alerts. To pursue a case, you need a constellation of circumstances which can build a case of trafficking. Because it's not like a simple crime like grievous injury. You see the wound. Here you need the totality of the evidence to establish that crime. Acts, means, purposes of exploitation, together.
I think sometimes when we think about the victims or people who are being trafficked, we tend to think of an image of someone hidden away behind a truck or crossing the border at night, but oftentimes these people are actually out in the open. They're people that we walk past every single day. So if that's the case, what's the role of society and the role of the community to better identify and perhaps, for lack of a better word, help these people?
Well, look, there are various stories of members of the public seeing pretty heinous things and doing nothing. The story of the woman who's being stashed in a car and nobody reported it, though people saw what was happening at the gas station. There are more subtle things. For example, in the United States, I know one of the highest values is privacy. So there's a lot of reticence to reporting anything which is happening in the home. This is an impediment. So in my view, the community is terribly important, especially in cases of migrant settlements where we've become accustomed to the lack of proper conditions, the lack of running water, the accommodations. We have to shatter those stereotypes, open our eyes and our ears, and take a chance, dare to report these crimes, or what we think are crimes. Of course, the community can play a bad part in trafficking, because certain forms of exploitation become imbued with stigmas in certain cultures. For example, if a woman is raped, in certain cultures this is a stigma, and this will prevent her from reporting. So the community can also be a force for bad, not only for good.
And what do we need in terms of legislation, and how might legislation affect perhaps some greater social change in the way that human trafficking is dealt with?
Well, the first thing I want to say is most countries on the globe have legislation, and most of that legislation is perfectly proper. So the major challenge we face is not the legislation, it's the enforcement. And that requires the training of every single practitioner who's involved: police, prosecutors, judges, labor inspectors, immigration officials, and of course also members of the public. As far as legislation, certainly the protocol provides a guideline, but I wouldn't say that countries need copy the protocol. They need to be aware, however, of the discourse around the issues that the protocol presents, such as consent of the victim.
Clearly, human trafficking is going to interface differently in different types of cultures. Could you tell us a little bit about that interface?
I think that every culture has values which in themselves may be good, but may impede the enforcement of trafficking laws. For example, in certain societies, it's accepted that children do some work. Even in the United States, in certain farm communities, children would do chores. When does this become forced labor? Depends on the culture. When I was asked, actually, I think it was in South Africa, are the standards, should we make the standards for child labor more stringent than those for adult? And maybe the answer is yes. There are other cultural forces, for example, in Western Africa, the juju. I don't know if you know of this, that juju priests often take trafficking victims and curse them. If you don't pay your debt, or if you try to flee, then a curse will be upon you. And this is very strong among these women. And one has to understand this in order to deal with them and persuade them to cooperate. In one very creative case, for example, in the Netherlands, the police or the prosecutors brought a former victim and a juju priest. And the juju priest abolished the curse, and the former victim said, "Here I am, I'm still alive," which was very creative, I thought, use of culture. Those are just some of the examples. Zimbabwe has a law which says cultural traditions will not be a defense. For example, forced marriage, child marriage. It's very interesting. Yeah.
In your view, should it or could human trafficking be prosecuted as an international crime, like a war crime or a crime against humanity?
Well, it has been done. For example, in the Kunara case, in the tribunal of former Yugoslavia, a number of Serbians took a number of Bosnian women and incarcerated them in certain huts, forced them to do all kinds of labor, and sexually exploited them, and even transferred them from hand to hand for remuneration. And that was a conviction for enslavement as a crime against humanity. I guess the advantage would be just to put a lot of light on that kind of, in other words, to emphasize the fact that not only is it a regular criminal offense, but it's a crime against humanity. It raises it one level, I think.
From all of your experiences, your work to date in Israel and beyond at UNODC, etc., what kind of lessons could you share for this part of the world in its battle against human trafficking?
Like every part of the world, and maybe I'm prejudiced because I was a national coordinator, I think there needs to be coordination between all parts of the government. And when I say that, I don't only mean police, prosecutors, judges. I mean police, prosecutors, labor inspectors, diplomatic corps, immigration officials, and between them and NGOs. Because NGOs have tremendous advantages, which it would be too bad not to make use of. Sometimes victims more readily report to them. They more readily discern new phenomena than does the government. And their skills are necessary. They're empathetic. How do you interview the victim? Maybe you can learn something from the NGOs. And of course, NGOs need the government in order to do the enforcement. Another thing I think is very important, of course, education, education, education. And this means forming a common language in all strata of the public and of the practitioners. What is trafficking? What are the strengths of a case? What are the weaknesses? How do we deal with it? You can't do too much education. And you need to do it all the time, unfortunately, because otherwise it's like a glass with oil and water. If you don't constantly shake it, it just settles again.
Rahel Gershuni, thank you very much for your time.
A pleasure.